12 minutes past 8 is the time. BBC Breakfast has been told about hundreds of cases of children with learning disabilities and autism being physically restrained and sometimes injured in special schools.
In the UK, there is no legal obligation to report restraints or notify parents that it's been used, but some are calling on the government to change that, be better at monitoring how the most vulnerable children are treated in the classroom.
Should warn you, this report from Jane McCubbin does contain some images that some of you may find distressing.
He was just a broken child. He was crying all the time with night terrors, panic attacks.
We couldn't understand anymore.
No.
Deirdre and Rodney tell me they just couldn't figure out a change in their son's behaviour until they saw his school diary.
Because his feet were tied, his waist was tied, there was a table on there. All these methods of restraint.
Harry has no mobility issues, but he does have a learning disability and autism. He might drop to the floor or run when he doesn't want to do something, as he often did in school. But because he is totally non-verbal, he has few other ways to communicate. His parents say they knew a chair was being used for meal times, but not to this extent or in this way.
He was in the chair for playing, he was in the chair for feeding, he was in the chair for learning.
It's very easy to put someone in a chair and strap them in. They keep them, they make life a lot easier for the staff. But certainly that wasn't a good thing for Harry.
Social services referred this to police, writing to the family to say this could be classed as physical abuse. The schools say they're unable to comment because of that investigation. We've been given information from hundreds of cases passed on to charities which are calling for action. Photographs of the rooms where children are locked up, injuries after physical restraints. Some say there is another way.
Very good.
Brilliant.
Mo is one of around 400 pupils here in one of England's biggest special schools.
This used to be the room used for seclusion.
Richard, the head, tells me it's now a sensory room where Chantel and Jeremiah are catching fish. While we film, Ayan drops to the floor and refuses to budge. Another girl bolts from a classroom. But here they have a hands-off approach. It's cut restraint incidents by over 80% and won the school awards.
Yay! You've got rid of the isolation room.
Yep.
No kids are locked in.
No.
You don't strap children into chairs.
No.
But are there situations where it's very difficult and maybe restrictive practices are needed?
Very occasionally. We're not dealing with naughty children. We're dealing with young people who are trying to communicate their needs, and it's understanding what their behaviour actually means and what it's saying. So they're not the problem. Often, as adults, we're the problem.
Charities tell us their evidence is the tip of the iceberg, but there's no way of knowing for sure because there's no legal obligation for schools to report incidents. The Department for Education in England told us there's no need for schools to report all restraint to parents or authorities, but should consider if staff need training. Scotland say isolation and restraint should only be a last resort and should be carefully monitored. In Wales and Northern Ireland, schools are strongly advised to keep records. As for Harry...
He's back to himself, he's laughing and giggling and he loves socialising, he loves being around other people, he loves getting out in the car again. All the things that he had totally regressed from, he's back doing again now.
The chair isn't used at all?
Not at all, no, not at all.
Jane McCubbin, BBC News.
So let's talk more about this. We can speak to Beth Morrison. She's been campaigning to change the law on restraint in Scotland after her son Callum was involved in an incident at school. Viv Cooper, you can see as well, from Challenging Behaviour Foundation, also joined by Michael Lubman, who's head teacher at Cambridge School, chair of the Association for Leaders in Special Schools. He's in Exeter for us. Very good morning to you. Good to see you here. So, Beth, your son Callum is now 20 years old.
Yes.
Just tell us a little bit about, first of all, a bit about Callum. What are the problems he's been facing?
Well, Callum has epilepsy, he's got cerebral palsy, he's on the autistic spectrum. He also has very severe communication difficulties. And Callum was restrained by 4 members of staff twice in 3 days back in 2010.
And you knew this because
he came home with bruises, and I contacted the school, and the school told me that they'd had to restrain Callum because he didn't want to come off a bicycle he was riding in the school, and that led to 4 members of staff taking Callum face down on the floor. He came home with his clothes soaked in urine in a bag. And, it was very, very distressing, both for Callum and for us.
Was that the ridiculously distressing? One can only imagine how painful it was for you as a parent, let alone for Callum.
Yeah.
Was that the first and only incident you were aware of in terms of that happening, or did you feel that this perhaps was the way things were done in that school?
I had absolutely no idea that a school could even do that, because Callum had been in a mainstream school previously and he'd never been subjected to that. And after those 2 days, he was never treated like that again. And we actually removed Callum from the school, and he went back into mainstream with a learning support base, and he was never treated like that. The school were fantastic.
So Viv, what your organisation is calling for, because there is a difference, isn't there, between, as you refer to, mainstream school and schools for children with special educational needs in terms of restraint, in terms of what should and shouldn't be reported. Can you explain what it is now and what you want changed?
Yes, I mean, I think the work that we've done at our two organisations has shown that disabled children are being physically and emotionally harmed in settings where they should be safe and thriving and well cared for. And the impact of that is significant and long-lasting. So families have told us that their children have unexplained bruises and injuries. They're very anxious. They have fear of adults. A whole range of long-lasting issues, and also what families are saying is that it's a hidden issue.
Can I be very clear? When you say unexplained, we've got to be very, very careful when we talk about this, because it veers onto the line of accusing people in the caring role of abuse.
Yes.
When you say unexplained injuries,
yes,
it's eventually, is it explained as to be part of a restraining mechanism?
Yes. So what's happening? So what families are telling us is similar to Beth in that their children are coming home from these settings with injuries, with no explanation, which they then try and find out how this has happened and what has occurred.
Okay. If I could talk to Michael Lubman, head teacher, thank you for your time this morning. One of the things that's emerged from this is that people may be surprised to know that if a child falls over and has a scrape on their knee or something, that has to be officially recorded. But if restraint is used officially and technically, that doesn't have to be recorded. And many people would be surprised by that.
I think in good schools, those bits of information are recorded, and that's what we would always promote, that all information like that should be recorded appropriately and parents should be informed.
So that you do that, that's a decision you've taken in your school because you consider that good practice. But presumably there will be occasions when, I mean, this is a very difficult area and sometimes dealing with difficult circumstances where restraint has to be used.
Yes, we would say restraint should be used when there is a danger to either the person themselves or to staff or other children, and that's the only point though, and then it should be as short an amount of time as possible. We should be looking all the time to positively support young people and make sure that they don't get to the point where they're that anxious or their arousal levels are so high that they are then a danger to themselves or others.
Mike, just briefly, how do you communicate that necessity or that ability to use restraint to parents who will be concerned, or when they first introduce their child to the school, when you're talking to them about how their children will be treated?
We have a positive behaviour policy, and that's on our website. We talk to all the parents when they arrive about the sort of things that we would do with children and work with children. It's very much around communication. All behaviour is communication, and we're looking to find out what is it the child is trying to tell us. Their communication might be inappropriate, but that doesn't mean they're not trying to tell us something. And say only when that escalates to it being very dangerous would we say actually we need to restrain the child for a short period and then try to get back to working out what the problem was really.
Beth, I heard a slight intake of breath when I think I used the phrase that there must be occasions when restraint has to be used. And I think that you would say that that's not necessarily the case. That's your experience, is it?
I think, and Vivian and I both agree on this, there will be sometimes, as a very last resort, that you may have to physically restrain a child. However, we need the governments to act and define what the last resort really is. Because if you have a child who cannot speak, they cannot say, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm tired, I'm in pain, the lights are too bright. So they will communicate that distress through their behaviour. And what are we doing? What are we saying to those little children who have no voice, that when you're communicating distress, you will be restrained and dragged along the corridor and put in the cupboard?
That's extreme,
yeah,
isn't it?
It is extreme.
What about, I mean, and this is, we could talk for hours about this, we could debate about this. What about parents? And as lots of parents will know, what about teachers who, say a child is just about to, I don't know, throw themselves on the floor off a chair or something, or lunge at another child through frustration, and there's a hand restraining, physically restraining. How do you make that judgment as to what is restraint too far? Do you see what I mean? It's so difficult to define, especially when you're that person in the caring role.
Well, we're talking about children with disabilities, and each child should have a positive behaviour support plan. So everyone should be agreed around this is the child's needs, this is how they communicate their needs. In these circumstances, this is how we will respond to it. So it should be part of a well thought through, planned approach to meet the child's needs, because as we've heard, behaviour is a communication. It's an indication of an unmet need, and we need to and if you respond inappropriately to the need, you're responding to the symptom, not the underlying issue.
Thank you very much, Beth. I know Callum's in a much happier place now, so that is good. Thank you for your time as well this morning. And Michael Lubman, thank you as well.